graduate students at universities, with students being required to pay up to £1,000 a year in fees. Over the years, these fees have rocketed, with some courses costing £9,250 for a typical 3-year period, something which the Chancellor is looking at to address and cap at a lower rate, while the Labour Party has pledged to abolish tuition fees altogether. Some observers argue that tuition fees have helped improve the higher education sector and offer by generating much-needed income into universities, allowing for extra resources into education, improved facilities, research, student support services and high-quality staff. Others would argue that tuition fees are simply plugging a £3.3 billion gap between the cost of research at universities and the revenue it generates. Whichever way you look at it, the issue of tuition fees and the provision of student loans is a controversial one. Putting people in debt, even before they start a career, is rightly not popular with students, irrespective of the threshold of earnings required before repayment. According to the Sutton Trust, 8 out of 10 students will never fully repay their tuition fee loans, and the decision to raise the minimum earning level at which loan repayments kick in from £21,000 to £25,000 means 81% of graduates will not pay back what they owe. Their report, called Fairer Fees, identified typical debt on graduating as being around £46,000, rising to £52,000 for those entitled to take out maintenance loans to cover the cost of living. The report also shone a light on the implications of Brexit, as currently EU students studying in the UK are entitled to the same tuition fee loans as British students, and figures for last year show that 11%, or 8,600 people, remained in arrears. The position after Brexit remains unclear. Universities, safe in the knowledge that virtually guaranteed income streams from tuition fees would rise every year, thus giving them financial stability, have been accused of paying eye-watering salaries to vice-chancellors and the like, and are very much on the back foot as politically tuition fees have been put under intense scrutiny. The petition being debated puts the whole subject into sharp focus, and given cross-party unease with things as they stand, I believe that this debate is timely. Back in the day when I accessed higher education, we were provided with a grant which had to be topped up by parental contributions. My folks did what they could, but couldn't afford their full share, and so, like many other working class kids from low-income backgrounds, I struggled to get by. But I did, and at least I didn't end up burdened with too much debt. Personally, I am uncomfortable with the fact that people, usually young people, have a financial noose placed around their necks on graduating, especially when the figures show the high levels of debt that remains unpaid. I will give way.
My honourable friend for giving way, and I congratulate him on securing this really important debate. Apologise I can't stay for all of it because I'm meeting a group of school children from my constituency shortly. Would my honourable friend agree with me that at a time of low productivity, it makes absolutely no sense for there to be disincentives for people to progress to higher education and thus to improve their skills and educational level of attainment?
I absolutely agree, especially for people from low-income backgrounds. I would prefer to see the end of tuition fees and return to a grant-based system or alternative method of funding. Thank you, Chair.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 182953 relating to university tuition fees. Lee Rowley.
Sir David, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I have to confess to being slightly surprised to bring the call first, but nonetheless I'm very happy to do so. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to contribute to the debate, and thank you to the Honourable Member for Hartlepool for introducing it. I wanted the opportunity to be able to contribute this afternoon because I this is an area which is close to my heart and one that I am particularly interested in. When I read the petition itself, I was somewhat intrigued by some of the statements that were being made in there. And I do think it's important that we have debates like this on the actual reality. And the motion, as we know, is that university fees are rising more and more. Well, a month or so ago, there was a statement that university fees are going to be frozen, although I accept that this petition will have been submitted before that was probably announced. And I think the motion goes on to talk about how £9,000 is too high for university fees, and the stress of being in debt is what puts individuals off applying for degrees. And I completely understand that notion, but the reality does not bear out. The statistics and the data and what is happening day in, day out in our universities does not suggest that that is actually occurring. UCAS's I looked at the UCAS information which they submitted after the last round of UCAS applications that were made, and the number of 18-year-olds who were going to university last year, when this scheme was in place, is at record levels, at nearly 250,000 students, up 1.5% from previous years. The total number of students in university currently is over 500,000, again at a record level, about 0.5% up, and you are 70% more likely to go to university now than in 2006 if you come from the kind of income groups and social economic groups that the Honourable Member from Hartlepool was describing, which I think both myself and him would share a characteristic of originating from. So I do accept that there is a challenge here. I accept that that many people are concerned, but the reality is that many more students are going to university than a number of years ago, and many more students from low-income backgrounds are going to university than compared with a number of years ago. So we have to be careful to have these debates on the facts, is my first fundamental point. The second point, I think, is we have to look again at what the principle is here. What are we trying to do, ultimately, around university fees? And the key question I always come back to when debating the principle on tuition fees is somebody has to pay, and the question is whom? And the question is either general taxation, i.e. the taxpayer pays, or there is some contribution made to the people who will ultimately benefit from that the most. When I went to university in 1999, I was the second year of tuition fees. I paid £1,000. I recognise that is nothing like the amount of money that is being asked for today. But I do accept the notion that if you are going to benefit from it, if you are likely to achieve a greater amount of pay over the period by which you over your working life, that therefore you should be expected, or you should be hoped to pay a greater share of the amount that it costs to get you into that position. And I'd be very happy to.
Right, on that point, would he not agree with me that actually there is a societal good to having highly educated population, and that in fact it shouldn't be all placed on the individual, but as a society we should value it and pay for it?
Completely accept that there is a societal good, and that is exactly why we should have debates like this, because the reality is still a proportion of costs per student on average in our university sector is being paid for by society. It is a portion, an increasing portion, which is being paid for by the individual, but a portion is still being paid for by society. So you're absolutely right to make that statement. The system already makes provision for that, and the question is where you draw the line. And obviously I will disagree. I'm happy to.
Well, gentleman, forgive me. Wait. So from his remarks and his answer to my honourable friend, he's accepting that there needs to be a balance, and that 9,000 for the majority as tuition fees is wrong, and it should be scaled depending on which institution you go to, which course you attend, etc. There should be factors determining how much you pay as tuition fees or not.
I'm accepting the principle that there should be a societal contribution and an individual contribution, which I think the Honourable Member from Wirral West was querying. And my argument is that it is absolutely correct that an individual should be expected, when they gain the most, to be able to contribute the most. Where you draw those lines is the kind of party political debate that we can have. I will obviously probably take a different view from the members opposite in this room today and from the leader of your party. So the question is, with regards to the principle, somebody pays, and it's either general taxation or or it is at least a contribution for the individual themselves. My own personal view is it should be a contribution from the individual themselves. And I understand and I recognise and I accept and I would support the direction of travel in recent years with regards to tuition fees with regards to that. The specific motion under debate today is with regards to a reduction back to £3,000. And in preparing for this debate this afternoon, I was looking at some of the economic bases by which the current system works. And my understanding is that if you did that, you would either be blowing a significant multi-billion pound hole in the national finances, which, if it is the case, and I wouldn't support the blowing of that hole into national finances, but if that was the case, those proponents of this measure would need to be able to explain where that additional money comes from. You would also likely be reopening a debate about whether we should be capping student numbers. So there is a question about aspiration and supporting aspiration there. You would also be probably reopening a debate about the amount of money that is spent in supporting students through waivers, through outreach programmes, through measures to increase retention, accommodation discounts and hardship funds, of which nearly £0.4 billion was associated in the coming year. So if that is the case for those proponents, I would be interested to understand where those alternatives come from or what is stopped in the event that the kind of tuition fee reduction that's proposed in this motion was to go through. That is not to say, I'd be happy to.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. I'm listening carefully to what he's saying, but would he not accept that there can be workforce issues with particular professions? So I'm thinking of nursing and midwifery. We have that at University of West London in my constituency. And Sir Peter John, the Vice-Chancellor, has contacted me. He's worried that there's been a 20% decrease in applications since the nurse bursary was cut. So, I mean, it feels like insult to injury, the student fees. I mean, he's pointed out it's a bit of an anachronism because of the £3,000, no one's suggesting going back to that. But, I mean, that profession has particularly suffered 60% down their applications on the normal cycle for the February intake. And given that there's been a steep fall in EU nurses, frozen pay, NHS cuts, it just feels that that particular profession is being battered by this as well as everything else.
Lee Rowley.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for making that point. I obviously am not as au fait with the specific subjects in the specific area that the honourable member from Ealing Central and Acton outlines, but if we are accepting the principle, which started in the late 90s and then was extended in successive periods, about trying to engender choice within this area and trying to also accept there is a market, and I know this will be controversial with some people in this room, but there is some element of market-based principles within this, then I accept there is a notion that for where there is demand or where there is challenge or where there are supply problems, that the market mechanisms should potentially have the opportunity to work. Now, I don't want to be totally critical of the debate today because I recognise that there is a genuine issue which the proponent of this debate put forward when they started their petition about concern about where we have ended up as a country with regards to this. But I accept that there are some issues in the system as a whole, and that's why I welcome what the government is doing in terms of their full review of tuition fees, which they announced, and the education market system, in the education system in general. I recognise that there has obviously been some inflation within the system in recent years, particularly, there's been discussions about Vice-Chancellor pay in the last few months. I accept that initially when the larger fee was put in, it was expected that not all institutions would go to the top amount of the fees, and that's why I think the review is a timely and important one. So the argument is not whether the system is working perfectly now, because I think it isn't. No system ever works perfectly, but this system obviously has challenges. The argument that there isn't areas that couldn't be improved. The argument that there are specific, obvious issues in the system which have been highlighted in recent months, and I would accept all of that. But ultimately, you have to go back to the principle. You have to go back to the principle of somebody pays, the taxpayer pays, or the individual pays, or the individual makes a contribution. I think it is entirely legitimate that the individual makes a contribution. I would be supportive of where this system is pending the fuller review of the detail. And ultimately, this is, to me, a question of hypothecation, quasi-hypothecation, or no hypothecation. Somehow this money is going to be spent and it's going to be paid back. The question is who pays it back. The question is whether that money is associated with the people who make the greatest benefit. And in my personal view, the people who benefit greatest from this should be the people who contribute the most. Thank you.
Can I remind members that the same rules apply in Westminster Hall as apply in the Chamber. So if backbenchers wish to speak, they will need to stand in the same way. As only Jim Fitzpatrick stood, I'm going to call Jim Fitzpatrick.
It's a pleasure to see you in the chair today, and thank you for calling me earlier than I anticipated, but clearly you've explained why that is the case, and fortunately I won't detain colleagues too long, so they won't have to wait their turn for any length of time. I'm grateful to the Petitions Committee and my honourable friend from Hartlepool for the opportunity to participate briefly in this debate. I'm also very pleased to follow the honourable gentleman who made a very thoughtful contribution, and I thought he was trying to outline the different pressures on the further and higher education system and the pros and cons of the different elements. And I thought it was a very fair presentation, and I do look forward to the Minister responding to his comments as well as everybody else's, as well as the Honourable Lady speaking on behalf of the Scottish National Party and an honourable friend from our Blackpool South. And I suspect he and I were the only two in the comments when tuition fees were introduced in 1998. So I'm looking forward to his wisdom prevailing on this debate, being the front bencher for my party at this point in time. I must confess, I only realised that this debate was taking place, Sir David, when alerted by the Communications Hub that my constituents were the 10th highest in numbers, 1,289 of them, in contributing signatures to the petition. I've tried to work out why this might be the case, but I haven't really arrived at a conclusion. And certainly, I haven't seen the email traffic from my constituents to support the level of concern that these numbers would suggest. But obviously, the petition has attracted them, and I'm very pleased to be able to make a brief contribution. I'm also grateful to the House of Commons Library for their paper as background to this debate, because, in fact, reading it brought back memories of the debates that we did have in 1998, introducing the tuition fees at £1,000 and in 2004 raising them to £3,000, and very much the discussions that we were having along the lines indicated by the gentleman who spoke previously about the cap on student numbers and releasing that cap and allowing more young people to go to further and higher education, and that would require some assistance, some contribution by way of tuition fees, and that argument clearly won the day. And in 1998, I was ambivalent about the £1,000, mainly because due to the conditions attached, most of the young constituents and families in my constituencies wouldn't be expected to pay, because the threshold, the household income threshold, below which £1,000 wouldn't be required, was where the majority of my young people were coming from. So tuition fees wouldn't have entered into the pressures that they would have experienced simply because of the household incomes in Poplar and Canning Town as it was in those days. Therefore, I assume I supported that. I've got no recollection that I didn't. However, it was the sister policy that went with it of abolishing maintenance grants, also raised by the honourable gentleman who spoke previously and focused in the House of Commons briefing paper, that concerned me then, because whereas fees and the introduction of them would have had minimal effect, the abolition of maintenance grants, which was proposed, would have had and did have a profound impact, and I voted against that, and I think that was my first and probably only vote against the three-line whip in our 11 years in government. Now, I know that many families locally would not have been able to afford to support their children into further or higher education without those grants. And the library briefing paper on this makes just this point when it quotes the NUS president when she said in her evidence to the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee that simply abolishing fees would not help students. She said just scrapping tuition fees would not solve the problem. It's about maintenance support. Scotland is a prime example. There's no tuition fees and students are still struggling. It is important to reinstate maintenance grants. It's interesting that at that time, Sir David, as you will remember, sorry I didn't include you in our little gang of survivors from 1998, because obviously you are non-political in the chair today, but you were there and you would remember, as my honourable friend on the front bench does also, that 4 years later the Labour government restored maintenance grants because it recognised that it was a very important policy, and that was very welcome. I'm very happy to give my way to my honourable friend Tremilly.
My honourable friend's making an excellent speech on his rebel past and what fees were like before they turned into the monster that they've become now. I just wondered if he, in those days, foresaw that cases like that of Siobhan Hallett of Acton would have occurred. She's on £27,000 and she pays £58 a month of repayments, but if she does any overtime, that goes up to £115. And she says, I feel like I'm being robbed every time I try to better myself in society. She wants to get on the housing ladder. She's being penalised. Her loans go up and up, and it's the student loans company who are taking what she earns.
My honourable friend makes a really important point, because the question of repayment, the question of when the repayments start, how much is actually repaid, at what point and at what interest rate is paid, all of these, and to be fair, I think the honourable gentleman who spoke previously raised these points as well, and I'm sure that the government is trying to weigh up all of these different elements, because they all impact on each other, and there is clear unfairness in the system, and I'm sure when my honourable friend gets a chance to make her own contribution, she will be majoring on this, and maybe I'll intervene in her to support the points that she's making, because they are very emphatic and clearly absolutely critical to the quality of life that so many young people experience in their time at university. I'm very, very pleased to give way to the honourable lady.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He referenced the situation in Scotland, and I just wanted to point out and make sure that he was aware that students in Scotland, of course, aren't saddled with £27,000 worth of debt in the way that English and other parts of the UK are saddled with, but also that last year almost 3,000 additional students qualified for a non-repayable bursary or saw their funding increase. So I'd like the member to comment on those particular situations.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady for mentioning Scotland. I will come back to that, because the position is also referenced in page 13 of the House of Commons library briefing, and I do note from that the Scottish Government is currently conducting a review of Scottish funding, which is clearly very welcome, because there are question marks about the way that the policies for tuition fees and loans and repayments are applied in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So I'm pleased to hear that the Scottish Government are carrying out this review, and I will come back in a moment to the House of Commons library briefing on that. But as I was saying, Sir David, I supported the introduction of tuition fees to help raise the cap on the numbers of young people going into further higher education and college university, because I think there was a clear recognition that the ceiling had been there for too long, and the 30% was not right for our 20th, 21st century country, and therefore there had to be a change. The library briefing makes the point that each £1,000 cut off of tuition fees would see universities lose £1 billion income, or the taxpayer would have to make up the difference again. The point made by the honourable gentleman that the taxpayer would have to meet that cost. Sir David, I don't support the abolition of tuition fees, but neither do I support £9,000 across the board. There should be a variable with highest fees for the Russell Group alone. 3,000 seems certainly too low for that. But the petition is very welcome and indicates that this debate is very much still alive. I'm quite happy to give way to my honourable friend. To the honourable gentleman.
There's a general agreement that to sustain good quality education, higher education, university, has to be paid for, and there are many aspects, the public purse, the individual. Would my honourable friend agree that we should maybe consider looking to employers who are also beneficiaries of the graduate or the postgraduate that comes to their business? Could they be greater players in funding the education system that we very much need and desire?
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point. An honourable friend earlier in her intervention made the point that the whole of society benefits from a higher skilled cadre of young people coming through the system, making us more productive, more energetic, more able to compete in the world market. So these are very difficult questions for the Minister. I'm sure he has all the answers for us, and we look forward to hearing them in due course. But yes, a contribution across the board is entirely appropriate. Sir David, the Library paper has some very interesting paragraphs on fees elsewhere, as I mentioned to the Honourable Lady in response to her intervention. It says, as I mentioned on page 13, the free fees policy in Scotland has been discussed by many commentators, most notably by academic Lucy Blackman-Hunter, who has suggested that free fees benefit the middle-class students the most. It's also been suggested that free fees policy is unsustainable and has led to the underfunding of Scottish universities and rising debt among poorer students. But as I mentioned, the Scottish Government have indicated a review, and I certainly wish them every success in that. As my son went to Glasgow University, and as a London-based, as a London-born resident, he paid his full tuition fees. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate the point, but that still doesn't address the fact that a lot of students going to university today will leave with significantly smaller debt than those students who are currently having to pay, as mentioned before, something like $27,000 in England and slightly less than that elsewhere in the United Kingdom.
And the Honourable Lady makes a good point. And of course, the point's also been made that there are so many students leaving university with such high debts, they will never pay them back. Therefore, the loss to Exchequer is quite transparent, and therefore that would suggest that the balance is wrong and there needs to be an adjustment. So I don't distract from what the Honourable Lady says. But as I mentioned, the fact that the Library paper says the Scottish Government is reviewing it, maybe they will make some adjustments to try and indicate how they would make the balance to be more equitable. And in conclusion, Sir David, I'm grateful to the petitioners for the opportunity to make these brief comments. Debts, interest rates, unpaid loans, the level of fees themselves have been key manifesto issues for every election since 2001, at least. And I think from today's debate, it's quite clear that they will continue to be. Thank you very much, sir.
Alexa Bell.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Sir David. And I want to thank my honourable friend, the member from Hartlepool and the Petitions Committee for bringing forward this debate after it was signed online by 160,000 people. So we can debate this subject today. This is the issue that first drew me into elected politics. As a student at the University of Leeds, I was concerned that the Deering Review would bring forward fees, ending the free education that I and many other members of this House enjoyed. This led me to seek election to the Student Union Executive at Leeds University. I spent that year on the Student Union Executive and every year since campaigning against tuition fees and for a return to free higher education. So this debate is very close to my heart, and I hope the government will take heed and reflect on the damage that increased fees are having. This government and the coalition that preceded it, that introduced the £9,000 fees, view higher education as nothing more than a pre-work training course and a source of personal economic mobility. This marketised view of education does nothing to differentiate educational institutions from private profit-making entities and markets such as retail. If you're a free market ideologue, then the system created by the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition is entirely logical. For the rest of us, however, it is deeply flawed. My view, and that of the 1,000 people that signed the petition, is that tuition fees are not a sustainable system. I'm sure my honourable friends on this side will agree that education is not a business, but contributes to the common good of the nation, which we used to call the common weal. If we look overseas, where in Chile, where under Pinochet, they reduced and stopped providing direct grants to universities. Bahram Bekhadria, from the World Bank team that went to Chile to help them reform the system, said, and I quote, "Universities are funded for teaching only via the tuition fees that students henceforth paid, and students received loans from the government to enable them to pay their fees." Sounds very familiar. This government's policy is straight out of the Pinochet free market playbook. Not my words, the words of somebody from the World Bank. One widely recognised to have failed. Well, after over 30 years, the Chilean government in 2015 concluded that this is an unsatisfactory way to fund higher education. Chileans are looking for a new system under which the government will provide grants to universities funded from general taxation. They have indeed started down this path, away from a fees-based system. I think looking at a country who undertook the free market experiment in higher education, which we are still in the early stages of, over 30 years ago, is instructive in seeing what will happen here in future. So in Chile, first, the debt of former students is colossal in relation to their earnings and is by far the highest in the world. England, however, has started to catch up. Graduate debt is exploding as cohort students from the new funding regime complete their degrees. Second, very much as in this country, in primary and secondary education already, previous Chilean governments encouraged private institutions which now educate 80% of those in tertiary education and are of variable quality. As a result, there are serious concerns about some private institutions creaming taxpayer-funded loans for students and making unsatisfactory provision in return. Third, these funding arrangements make it difficult, if not impossible, for the government to steer the higher education system in a way that is possible with direct grant funding. This matters if, as governments around the world, including the UK, increasingly believe higher education is a vital element of a country's economic and social development. That is a vision of our future unless we change the system. The Chilean government of Michelle Bachelet has now started to reform the system, and 80,000 university students received free education last year in 2016, and the majority of students in Chile had a cost reduction. Chile took 30 years to reverse the mistakes of free market in higher education. Let's not repeat the same mistakes here. It's shameful that given the contribution of the public purse to university is one of the lowest in the OECD, we are not seeing great levels of state funding towards something that contributes so much towards our nation's welfare. The government is contributing no more now with £9,250 of fees than when £3,000 fees were introduced. In fact, with the proposed freeze at £9,250 this year and next year, universities are seeing a real terms funding cut. Students are paying for the majority of the system, but seeing cuts to university funding from central government. Both students and universities are victims of the government's chaotic policy and free market ideology, which means the government take no responsibility for the destruction and dismantling of our once renowned sense of education, but degrade our institutions by starving them of funding, of state funding. I say it's time to call a halt to the coalition's free market experiment and the government's continuation of it for our universities, and implement a system that encourages higher education to be readily available for anyone with a will and desire to learn. Thank you.
Any further speakers? Mark Roder.
Thank you, Sir David. I appreciate the opportunity to speak this afternoon, particularly as I was due to be in a SI committee, and I was very kindly relieved of that duty by a colleague. I would also like to thank all of those who signed the petition, which allows us to have this debate this afternoon. And I'd like to support my comments, the Honourable Member for Headingley and other colleagues for Hartlepool and other speakers on this side. In particular, I would like to address the issue of the fee repayments in my own constituency of Reading East. Reading is a university town, as many people may know. It's also a town with a particularly high number of graduates, very high proportion of highly trained and skilled people in the local workforce working in industries such as IT, research, both in the public and private sector, and also in a whole range of applied technology businesses, many of which are exactly the sort of business the government would seek to see grow, in particular as we are due to leave the European Union. However, many of these young graduates, particularly my constituents in Reading East, are above the threshold for loan repayment, and yet whilst they are above it, they do not yet command such high salaries as to insulate them from the effect of fee repayments. I notice other honourable members nodding, and I believe this is a similar situation in many high-growth parts of the country. I'd like to give some additional detail to illustrate this and to point out how the tuition fees policy, mistaken as it is, has a particularly harmful impact on this group of people and indeed on economic growth in these areas which are, as the government itself has pointed out, hubs which should be fostered. If you take a very practical example, for a teacher in their 20s living in Reading who's had effectively a 15% pay cut, this also addresses both public and private sector staff, many private sector employees also have had a real terms pay cut. They face an additional charge on their income of up to 9% a year through tuition fee repayments, because they will be in the cohort which has had to go through the £9,000 a year regime. Imagine the impact on key workers like teachers, nurses, social workers, university staff themselves, IT workers or others. And you have to see this in the context of high house prices and a high cost of living, such as high travel to work costs through a season ticket to London or a season ticket for local commuting. Many people within the Thames Valley commute between the different towns which have a growing high-tech industry, such as Maidenhead, Reading, and indeed Newbury, where Vodafone are based. House prices can be as high as £300,000 for a two-bedroom terrace in Reading. Not all at that price, but that's the context that we're talking about. That, I believe, is significant. And do bear in mind that at the same time as being a young person in their 20s or early 30s having to repay these large amounts of debt, facing relatively static pay or indeed pay cuts, and facing high house prices, young people are also in the position of perhaps wanting to start a family and maybe indeed delaying this because of the impact of all these extra costs and burdens on themselves. There's also a point to make about employers. It's worth considering that many employers in these sorts of areas, such as Reading or other high-growth areas, are suffering real staff shortages. Now, I believe that part of the cocktail of factors affecting those shortages can indeed be the high cost of repayments, the high real cost of repayments in a high cost of living area. We have shortages locally of teachers. I had a meeting with local head teachers only last week where this was pointed out to me, and it's the group of young staff who are potentially some of the most important in the educational sector, those who've gone through their initial teacher training, are settling in, are bedding in, and who potentially have a lot of their career ahead of themselves, but who are moving out of our area to live in a lower cost part of the country where the effect of the repayments of loans will be less. The same is true for social work, nursing and midwifery, and other areas we've had real concerns raised. Our local hospital is one where the 4-hour A&E wait has been, the target has not been met for many, many months. But they're also private sector employers, so I believe are heading in the same direction. In our local IT sector, we have a number of very large employers. We also have a burgeoning group of entrepreneurial small businesses and a large supply chain. And many of the people in those supply chain businesses, and indeed entrepreneurs, are not able to command the same salaries as some of the highest of high flyers in the most blue chip industries. And I do hope that the government will consider this, particularly on a day when they've launched their industrial strategy, and will reflect on the need to allow these clusters to develop in the sorts of towns and cities like Reading and other small and rapidly growing urban centres with a university, which are exactly the sort of engines that we need for our economy, particularly as we face the challenge of Brexit. The other additional point I would like to make very briefly before handing over to other colleagues is that the challenge of repaying this sort of debt is increasing year on year, given the context that I've just described. Not only have tuition fees themselves risen, but also the other costs, in particular, the cost of housing, which is significant and growing. There's not the expansion of housing supply. I know that the honourable members opposite will want to point out the government's measures in the budget recently. I'm afraid I remain sceptical on these measures, having seen that other government measures have not raised the supply of housing, and also indeed having seen that sadly, under George Osborne, plans for 1,000 new council houses in the towns I represent were stopped by the government in a mistaken approach. And indeed, the government's also fought the local council, which has tried to agree a larger proportion of affordable housing to be kept at affordable levels in private developments. So given that context, given the rising house prices, the lack of real supply in an area like mine, also given the further austerity, which will lead to further falls in real earnings of people in the public sector and possibly other private sector colleagues, as well as the local labour market is depressed as a result, I think it's high time for the government to reconsider the tuition fees policy. And I would urge honourable members opposite, particularly the Minister, who I know is a deeply cerebral and thoughtful man, to reconsider this policy and perhaps to take a step back, as my colleague has mentioned, to look at the international comparators and see where we're going, and to perhaps reconsider this worrying policy, which I believe is mistaken. And whilst honourable members opposite may have the best of intentions, I believe if they look at the international comparisons and look at the trajectory that we're on, they should, and indeed at some point will, reconsider. And I would like to finish by just reminding them that, if I can make a small plug for Reading University and other local institutions, we are lucky in our town to have an institution like Reading to drive local growth. And I hope we can continue to see that growth develop and flourish, both in IT, in science and in other fields. But I do think that the tuition fees policy is potentially an obstacle to that growth.
If there are no further backbench contributions, I'm going to move to the front benches. Carol Monaghan.
And it's good to be speaking once again on a debate on tuition fees, and I thank the member for Hartlepool for kicking off this afternoon's debate. This government enjoys the phrase "make work pay," well today I'll start my contribution by saying that we need to make education pay, because for many young people faced with the choice of crippling debt as a student or to take a low-paid, unskilled job, there's only one route possible. The member for Hartlepool talked about his working-class background and how university was a struggle for his family. Well, I understand that completely. I also come from a working-class background. I was one of 5 children, and all 5 of us went to university, only possible because not only did we not pay fees, but we also had generous maintenance grants to support us and to support our family whilst we were at university. This debate is fundamentally about the value we place on education and about the ambition we have for our young people's future and for our nation's future. Are these young people who are embarking on a course in tertiary education going to contribute economically and societally to our nations? Or do we consider that we are providing them with a service for which they must pay? The member for Leeds North West talked about the free marketisation of education, talked in detail about the experience of Chile. He explained it had taken 30 years for Chile to understand and appreciate the errors of their ways and to change their structure entirely in terms of tuition. And I hope it doesn't take 30 years for the ministers here to do the same for English students. The member for North East Derbyshire asked who pays, and his conclusion was those who benefit. And actually, I don't disagree with that. But I also question who is it exactly who does benefit? Because as legislators, we must be clear about this. In the debate on the 13th of September on this issue, the Secretary of State talked about burdening society with fees. Now, that's a dangerous piece of spin that this government can ill afford to peddle. Excuse me, you'll have to put up with my croaking voice throughout. I apologise.
Yes, Prime Minister.
Yes, please. The economic success of the UK post-Brexit will rely on having a well-educated population with a range of educational experiences and expertise. We already know that we have skill shortages in STEM, in healthcare, in education and digital, which means that graduates are needed now more than ever before to ensure that the UK remains competitive in our non-EU environment. If we look at engineering alone, Engineering UK estimate that there is an annual shortfall of 20,000 engineering graduates. When that is considered, the fees for tertiary education become illogical. We can clearly see the effects of this policy when we consider the abolition of nursing bursaries. And the member for Ealing Central, who is no longer in our place, talked about the decline in those choosing to study nursing at the same time as we have a sharp drop in EU nurses registering to work in the UK. This must act as a wake-up call to the government and their damaging policies. It's a fundamental principle of the SNP that education should be based on the ability to learn and never the ability to pay. And we've got a strong and principled record of opposing increases in tuition fees in England and Wales. And we'll continue to reject any legislation that seeks to increase the financial burden on these students. Of course, fees are not the only attack on English students. The interest in tuition fees has risen sharply, maintenance grants have been scrapped, and now we hear that debt on completion of course has reached an astronomical £50,000 for some students, which will leave many young graduates saddled with debt throughout their working life. The member for Reading East talked about the threshold for repayment and talked about the costs of living and the salaries for those who were possibly just above the threshold. And that, coupled with the increased cost of living, made repayments a huge burden financially on them in their week-to-week finances. In Scotland, we take a holistic view of education. I've already referred to tertiary education. I try to refer to tertiary education generally because the distinction between further education colleges and higher education institutions in Scotland is fluid. I've heard many times in this place a spin on UCAS figures that fewer young people from disadvantaged backgrounds enter higher education in Scotland than other parts of the UK. This is used as an example of why it would be wrong to abolish fees. Of course, members here know, and I'm sure the Minister knows, that this is simply not the reality. In Scotland, 1/3 of our degree-level courses take place in further education. This is not accounted for in UCAS figures. Audit Scotland reports that this amounts to more than 45 students undertaking higher education in Scotland's colleges. In Scotland, many students access higher education from further education, also not captured in UCAS figures. I've quoted this before, but for the benefit of those who haven't heard this, let me cite what UCAS has to say on the matter. They say, for people living in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, UCAS covers the overwhelming majority of full-time undergraduate provision. In Scotland, there is a substantial section of provision that is not included in UCAS figures. This is mostly full-time higher education provided in FE colleges, which represents around 1/3 of young full-time undergraduate study in Scotland. Accordingly, the statistics on UCAS entry rates and acceptances reflect only the undergraduate study that uses UCAS. To put simply, UCAS figures only consider direct entry from school to university and take no account of degrees delivered in FE, or indeed young people who enter university from an access or college course. Yes, absolutely.
It's an omission and it's off the cuff from myself. But I do believe in Scotland we've lost 150,000 further education places, which has reduced accessibility to further education for many. And we're still, despite the very good efforts of the Scottish Government, we're still not attracting enough people from the poorer incomes to university. They appear to be facts that you may wish to agree or disagree with.
Well, Monaghan. I thank the honourable member for his intervention. Of course, maybe he's read some figures but doesn't fully understand them. We've got college places aplenty in Scotland. We've got college places that cannot be filled, and the number of full-time college places in Scotland now is greater than it has ever been at any time in the past, 116,000 currently. In an article in the Times Higher Education last year, Professor Danny Doring of Oxford University said, in contrast to England, Scotland shows what a real narrowing of inequalities looks like. There, the most dramatic change has been in the proportion of children from the most disadvantaged quintile of areas going to the highest tariff universities. Home student applications continue to rise in Scotland, even as they stall in England. So to talk down the interactions between FE and HE and getting young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into tertiary education does a great disservice to the institutions and the young people served by them. Our free tuition policy benefits 120,000 undergraduate students every year, saving them from massive debt seen in other parts of the UK. The member for Poplar and Limehouse stated that he was probably one of only 2 members here at the time when the tuition fees were first brought in 1998. Well, in 1998, my son was born. My son is now in his 2nd year of university in Scotland and has no tuition fees. He is, at the moment, still debt-free because, like many students in Scotland, particularly in the west of Scotland, he's living at home and he has a job to supplement his life, his social life, if that's required. But he is debt-free and hopefully will remain so. But even taking into consideration my previous comments about UCAS numbers and UCAS statistics, the number of students from Scotland's most deprived areas entering university has increased by 19% in just 2 years. We're clearly ahead in supporting these young people to ensure they remain in education. Alistair Sims from University Scotland says that the entry rate for 18-year-olds from the most deprived areas of Scotland is 51% higher than 10 years ago. But despite the attempts of this Tory government to use statistics to spin the story, the facts in Scotland are different. In Scotland, we place a value on our young people, from baby boxes to free tuition. We're telling them they're important and we need them. We're told that our free tuition prevents Scottish students accessing the available places. This, again, would help the Tory spin, but once again I have to disappoint. Since SNP came to office in 2007, the number of Scottish domiciled full-time degree entrants has risen by 12%. And since 2013, the total number of funded places available at Scottish universities, including additional places to widen access to students from Scotland's most deprived areas, have also increased. There's no doubt that the Scottish Government's investment in additional places for access students and for those progressing from college has also had a positive impact. We're investing £51 million a year to support 7,000 places, including those for access and articulation from FE to HE. And we are reaping the benefits. The UCAS statistics for this academic year show that more than 34,500 applicants living in Scotland accepted a place this year, an increase of 2% and a record at this stage in the cycle. Now, contrary to what the member for North East Derbyshire said, all other UK nations saw a fall in the number of people accepted to university compared with last year. Of course.
I'm grateful to Honourable Lady for giving way. I referenced in my speech a comment from the House of Commons Library briefing paper that said, as I mentioned to our honourable friend, that the Scottish Government are carrying out a review of this whole area of policy. Is that the case, or is it not? Because she's painted a very positive picture, and if it is like that, then why would they have to carry out a review?
Of course, the review is taking place, and despite the positive picture, it is a positive picture. We don't stop at that. We will keep going until we can ensure that every young person, regardless of background, can go to university or can see university as something they would like to do. And there's other things that Scottish Government are doing. In Glasgow, they run something called the Advanced Higher Hub, and I've mentioned this before in this place. The Advanced Higher Hub is Advanced Hires in Scotland are the highest school qualification. And the Advanced Higher Hub is funded by Scottish Government, supported by Glasgow City Council and Caledonian University, and it takes young people from disadvantaged schools all over Glasgow and brings them together to do their advanced hires. Now, the idea was if there were only 1 or 2 pupils doing advanced hires in a particular school, it wasn't economically viable to run this particular course, and bringing them together made it economically viable. But one of the side effects is that they have their lessons on a university campus. They start seeing university as something they can all do. It seems normal, it normalises the process, and the number of young people that attend the hub who are now going to university is just overwhelming. It's a huge success story. So we'll continue to do all we can to widen access and ensure our young people are given the best opportunity to succeed. Now, I want to say something about Labour's position, and I welcome Labour's stance on tuition fees, and I would support any attempts to reduce or abolish these charges. I'm struggling to understand Labour's position. And I want to have faith in it, and I want to believe the Labour Party on this, but we see the Labour government in Wales increasing tuition fees as well. So I call upon and I appeal to Labour colleagues here, follow the SNP, talk to your Labour colleagues in Wales, look at what can be done so that the public can be assured of your intent.
Two Scotlands. I'm sure there is, because the Scotland I'm seeing in my mind's eye, where education at one time was the envy of the world, is now struggling, which I regret very much. And I understand in the PISA scales that a measure of education, Scotland has slipped back to 27th, behind Lithuania. I know it's not linked to university or higher education, but really, Scotland's good, but we need to do some improvement in our education system.
Earl Monaghan.
I'm happy to talk about PISA. I'm happy to talk about Scottish education. It's amazing that throughout the world, Scottish education is lauded as a shining example. It's only here it's not. We come here and we hear about how awful Scottish education is. Scottish education is ranked extremely highly. In terms of the PISA tests look at pure knowledge, rote learning. They ask pupils to recall facts. That's not what Scottish education system is about. There is an element of that, but it's about problem solving, it's about employability, it's about communication skills. In fact, it's about everything that employers are looking for that are not captured in any PISA tick box tests.
Would the honourable member give way?
Sorry, yeah, absolutely.
I'm very grateful to the member of Glasgow North West giving way. I'm just interested in the arguments that she would use when meeting her constituents or others in Scotland about why those who are having vocational education should be subsidising the children of their neighbours who are getting higher education. And one of the issues, I think, for many of us in England is that the huge rise in apprenticeships where people are earning while they're learning and becoming self-sufficient doesn't begin to justify to me why they should be subsidising their neighbours' children. What would she say to that?
I thank the honourable member for that. We place a huge value on vocational training as well, and I would invite him to join me in Glasgow College, City of Glasgow College, where they are looking not just at degree-level courses, but they're also looking at vocational courses. And nobody there is considering that those students who are studying vocational courses are subsidising anyone else. In fact, City of Glasgow College, which is a fabulous new facility right in the heart of the university sector. We've got Caledonian one side of it, we've got Strathclyde the other side, and Glasgow just a mile and a half away. City of Glasgow College is now the shining example to all of them, and many young people at that college are the envy of those in the higher education institutions.
Can I come back to her on that point?
Absolutely.
I'm very grateful, and I have been to Glasgow, no, not for a few years, and I would be interested to see how Glasgow College are doing it. But at the end of the day, if we're going to reduce university fees in the way that she's been suggesting, someone is going to have to pay for that. And the truth of our system at the moment is we've got 20 of the best 100 universities in the world, and that's not least because of the investment that's gone into them. We have overseas students who are subsidising effectively our own students, and if we're going to lower the fees, then someone is going to have to mind that gap. Who's that going to be?
It's quite simple. Once again, look north. I fully believe our party has as one of its fundamental principles that education is about the ability to learn, not about the ability to pay, as I've already said. It's a duty of government, it's a duty of business, it's a duty of society, and that includes the taxpayer, to ensure that we've got a well-educated population, a population that can then provide economic growth in different businesses and different sectors. Economic growth that's going to be struggling post-Brexit. It's a duty of all of us to pay our taxes in order that those taxes can fund the higher education of our young people. Absolutely.
Thank you, Sir David. I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way for a moment. I just wanted to make a point of clarification about PISA, which I think is a very interesting international study. As a former civil servant in DFE some years ago and someone who's worked in the sector recently, I do think it's important to look at the broad picture that PISA gives, but also to understand its strengths and weaknesses. One of the things that I think is significant about PISA is the systems which are countries which have education systems which do best in the PISA test tend to be those with high levels of investment in education, high levels of qualification of teachers, and a very generally pro-educational culture. And the Western countries, which, as people here may know, tend to do best in that report, are Finland and Canada, both countries which I think have a lot to offer in terms of pointing us in the right direction. But I would also say, in terms of Scotland and the comments that she makes about the nature of the PISA assessment, my understanding of it from having worked with academics who are specialists in comparison of different education systems and indeed broader educational research is that there are criticisms of it, and it's one of a number of measures. I'm sure the Minister may want to comment as well on this, but it doesn't measure rote learning. It measures students' ability as teenagers to understand some quite complex material and also to act on their own. So I think just trying to dismiss this in that way is actually somewhat maybe misleading, and she perhaps needs to look further into this issue. That's not to say that it's perfect. There is a very extensive, learned debate amongst academics who specialise in education policy on its pros and cons, but I would just caution her in trying to dismiss it as a kind of rote learning exercise, which, in my understanding, it is not.
Carol Monaghan.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I'm not here to discuss PISA. I'm happy once again to talk about PISA, but the fact is there are many things about our education system in Scotland. The education system in Scotland has changed quite dramatically over the last 10 years, and it's changed so that it matches the needs of businesses, the needs of employers. And also allows our young people, those who want to go on to higher or further education, to do that as well. So there are many things that are done in Scotland that are simply not captured by PISA. I'll just finish by saying that the IFS calculated that if student debt were to be scrapped immediately in England, it would add 20 billion to the UK government debt, but delaying the decision until the end of the current Parliament would add 60 billion, 3 times that amount. So that's maybe something for the government to think about, because if that decision had to happen, it should happen sooner rather than later. The SNP are fully committed to ensuring fair access to higher education, so that every young person, regardless of background, has an equal chance of going to university, and we'll continue to work hard to ensure that that is the case.
Gordon Marsden.
Thank you very much, Sir David, and can I say it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I also thank my honourable friend, the member for Hartlepool, for introducing the debate today, and indeed the debate on the petition, with crispness but with insight. The truth of the matter is, of course, that a lot of water has run under the bridge since this petition was formed. Members will have seen, I think from the comments in the House of Commons Library, that this was put together as an e-petition before the general election was called, and therefore was postponed, and now we are having the debate on it today. As I say, a lot of water has run under the bridge, perhaps under our bridge and also under the Honourable Gentleman's bridge since then. But the reality which prompted 166,000 people to put their names on that petition remains the same. The current system of fees at record highs and potentially rising ahead in the years ahead is unsustainable. I want to say that I think this has been a good-natured and a thoughtful debate, and with some excellent contributions on all sides. And it's the first time I've heard the honourable member for North East Derbyshire and pay tribute to his speech. And of course, there are always different ways of looking at how these things have gone. And he's quoted the figures which get dished out by Tory whips at every education questions about the participation in education, and that's true in certain areas and certain cohorts of young people. But what we have to think about is not simply young people, we have to think about people of all ages, because that is one of the issues, the key issues that we're going to face in the next 10 years. And indeed, in those young people themselves, there are some disturbing signs in terms of completion, which I'll refer to later, that make the picture perhaps not quite as rosy as the Honourable Member suggests. We've had some excellent contributions on our side. My colleague and honourable friend, my honourable friend, the MP for Poplar and Limehouse, who not only reminded himself and myself of our mortality in this place, but also the chair. It may or may not be a good thing to do. But the truth of the matter is exactly as he said, that the decisions, and people forget, of course, that the decisions that were taken in 1997, which that's 1998, were the result of the Baker-Deering report, which had a consensus in this House. And it had a consensus in this House then because of the issues that it needed to address then. But even then, there were lots of concerns about the issues of maintenance grants, and as he rightly says. And you know that Maynard Keynes famously said that when facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Well, that is one of the reasons, and the rising issues which we've discussed today, that is one of the reasons why our party is now committed to what we actually said we would do in our manifesto. Because the loss to the Exchequer, in my view, and I think in the view of many, of the funding processes here is becoming unsustainable. My honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, with a huge amount of erudition and reference, stressed, nevertheless that did not affect the fact that he was stressing, and absolutely rightly, that the government, this government in particular, although the previous government of David Cameron was also guilty of it, has an obsession with a sort of ideological viewpoint that, as I've said before, could have come from the pages of Ayn Rand, in the sense that it regards higher education principally, I mean, from time to time it sort of throws bits of food off the table to the public good, but by and large they regard it as a private consumable, and that is one of the issues that we on our side of the House, and indeed other progressive members across the House, I think, take strong issue with. And of course, Bekram Bakandia, to whom the honourable gentleman alluded, and the Chilean example was a fascinating one, has to be remembered that he was not only a distinguished director of HEPI, which the honourable gentleman and I use frequently and to bounce ideas off, but also the director of the Higher Education Policy Institute for 10 years. So he knew what he was talking about. I was also very pleased and interested in the contribution of my honourable friend, the MP for Reading East, and I think the points that he was making about the negative, if I can put it this way, the nudge impact on groups of people, and he talked particularly about this issue in the South East. And one of the reasons, of course, from a northern perspective, why we were not happy with the freezing of the threshold was that it was bringing actually more and more people in the North and the Midlands who had graduated into that repayment trap too early as well. The truth of the matter is we should see from this whole process the problems of the repayment area, and that's why we need to look very strongly at it. And the Honourable lady, the member for Glasgow North West, who I was very pleased to work with on the Higher Education Bill, made a number of interesting points, some of which I agreed with, some of which I didn't. But one of the things that she talked about, the impact of fees on English students of all of this, but of course the government's fee policies and the tuition fees e-petition affects not just English students, it affects tens of thousands of students doing further education, higher education, in further education colleges like mine in Blackpool. It also affects thousands of Scottish students in England and thousands of students from Northern Ireland. And the Minister might want to pause for thought on that, of course, because the DUP have been less than keen on tuition fees, which is why they absented themselves from our tuition fees debate on September the 13th in the main chamber, and why the government on that occasion then had to flee the field and were forced to allow our opposition motion to pass unopposed. So the honourable gentleman should have a care not to rub up his DUP colleagues the wrong way, otherwise he might find there will be another addition to that £1 billion down payment for their support. Sir David, tuition fees that came through by the government for the general election saw the basic rate on tuition fees rise from 6,000 to 6,250 a year, and the higher rate from 9,000 to 9,250. And according to the Sutton Trust's recent report, Fairer Fees, the average debts for students are now around 46,000. And student fees in the UK are 10 times higher than the European average, twice as high as in the US. And in June this year, the Institute for Fiscal Studies sounded further alarms about the government's direction of travel. The IFS said replacing maintenance grants with loans results in students from low-income families graduating with the highest debt levels in excess of 57,000. Changes since 2012 have increased the repayment of almost all graduates, increasing the burden of student loans the most for low and middle earners. And again, I have made reference to this in other places in this House before now. The July 20th report, which is commissioned from London Economics by UCU, suggested, of course, also that thousands of graduates will suffer a midlife tax crisis through repayments of accrued interest on student loans, which now, with a ninefold increase in inflation from 0.3 in April 26, that of course was before the Brexit referendum, will get radically worse. So none of this exactly hands out a welcome sign to young people who've got a place or hope to go to university. And it's significant, and the Sutton Trust have issued members here with a fact sheet on student debt, but they've also done research which shows that in 2017, the financial worries about HE was particularly pronounced and increased in families with low levels of affluence, 66%, compared with 46% in high affluence households. And no wonder, therefore, that the results both of the Higher Education Policy Unit and the Higher Education Academy student experience show that just 35% believe their higher education experience represented good or good value for money. Now, I've talked also about the issues around dropout rate. And two recent reports from Offer and the Social Market Foundation point to growing dropout rates, particularly among students from disadvantaged backgrounds. I've already referred to the Sutton Trust survey. That showed that the poorest statistics for school students wanting to plan for higher education in 8 years. And I want to make a point at this point, which I think the government seem to neglect. It's not just a question. I've talked before about the fact that you can nudge people away from things as well as towards them. It's not just a question of the increasing pressure on those people who have taken out loans. It's also a question, and how that then affects their social mobility. It's also a question for how it puts off people who might want to go to higher education in the first place. That, by its very nature, is much less quantifiable, but it is indeed, in my view, a real factor that needs to be discussed. What is clearly part of this equation, however, is the impact on part-time and mature students. And the main casualties of the increases in tuition fees from 2012 from 3,000 to 9,000 have been mature students and part-time learners. In England, there has been a 60% drop in the number of part-time students since 2010-11, The Minister, I know, said on several occasions that he thinks that the argument is far more complex than that, but I actually think that the statistics, and many people think the statistics tell their own story. And we simply cannot afford to have that hemorrhaging of involvement of those groups, because the figures in terms of skills are stark. Only 13% of the 9.5 million in the UK who are considering higher education in the next 5 years are school leavers. The majority of them will have to be working adults. And there is a social dimension to this issue, and it is underlined by the fact that 1 in 5 undergraduate entrants in England from low participation neighbourhoods choose or have no option, perhaps for financial reasons, to study part-time, and yet these are the sorts of people who are being affected. And even the Minister's distinguished predecessor, the Lord Willetts, has now admitted that the decisions that they made in 2012 in trebling tuition fees, which of course at that time were buttressed by various safety mechanisms for social mobility, which were systematically stripped away both by this government and by the previous government, weaken that argument still further. And those are not good bases on which this government, or indeed any government, should defend the current system. Indeed, the growing sense that the government's settlement for higher education is both divisive and financially unstable is palpable, especially as regards tuition fees. And as Keith Burnett, the Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield University, put it sharply in a Times Higher Education article in June, with total debt forecast to hit 200 billion in 6 years and to pass 1 trillion by 2045, it will dwarf credit card debt. Now, not surprisingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, on the basis of their disappointing general election results, and I think it's important that we recognise this, Sir David, it wasn't just students who turned against the government in a big way. It was young people in generally, because the student issue and the way in which the government was dealing with it was seen as emblematic of the government's attitude towards young people in general. So it's not surprising, therefore, that in government there's been lively discussion about what should be done. The First Secretary of State acknowledged that student debt was a huge issue. The Leader of the House was talking about it, although they didn't come forward to properly discuss these matters. And indeed, of course, one of the leading members of the government, and if one is to believe what one hears, very much a darling of Tory activists, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Halton, Price and Howden, is on record as having said in 2010 that he'd opposed the plans to increase fees to as much as £9,000 a year. I simply don't believe that this is something we can allow to continue. I've always been against tuition fees. In 2005, our policy was abolition, and I was one of the drivers behind that. So that's the reality of where we stand today. And the government has already conceded the point that this situation with fees is unsatisfactory. Because if they thought that the current system was working well and would be sustainable in the long term, they would not have tinkered with it at their Conservative conference. They capped fee rises at £9,250 and increased the repayment threshold of student loans following the party conference. But the Minister and the Prime Minister also committed to a review of HE funding and student finance as one of the central announcements in her conference speech. And yet, the Minister has yet to reveal the details of this review, which he seemed singularly unhappy about associating himself with at the conference and subsequently. And the Chancellor failed to mention it in the budget. So will the Minister today let us know what are the terms of reference for the review? Will it be a full consultation? And when will it report back? And of course, indeed.
My honourable friend knows the answer to whether or not the further education sector, which I know is very close to his heart. I've just left the reception of the Association of Colleges London region, and there was great dismay there that the government have been silent almost on what the future arrangements are going to be for the further education sector, just as he's outlining the absence of any clarity about where the government's going generally in this whole area.
Well, I'm very grateful.
Gordon Marsden.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for raising the issue and the situation in further education colleges, because a number of further education colleges, including my own, took the leap of faith in the late 2000s, very much encouraged by the then Labour government, and set up higher education departments. And those higher education departments it must be allowed to flourish, but it does seem to me that they are bearing not just the burdens that I'm talking about generally, but particular burdens because of the nature of the young people that they take in. Well, actually, it's a double whammy, because they take in young people and who come from poorer backgrounds. They're precisely the sort of people who are most likely to be put off by rising fees. They also take in older people who wish to reskill and retrain, and they too are precisely the sort of people who are likely to be put off. And we know that because we see what is happening with the advanced learning loans that the government introduced progressively, largely, but not entirely, for purely further education, where in fact 60% of the money put out in those advanced learning loans year by year, and the figure has barely changed, has remained the same. That is a crisis for FE colleges, but it's also a particular crisis for HE in FE colleges. So our plans, as you may know, Sir David, would uprate the funding to universities in line with inflation, whilst the government's is basically to impose a real terms cut in funding. And of course, beyond reversing, of course, rising fees might have been easier to swallow if they had been put back into the system. But again, as Million Plus have said, and again, as I think has been referred to today, there has been no increase in direct grant available from government for university courses in the arts, in the humanities, in social sciences, in architecture and economics, just to name a few of the subjects affected, since 2014 to 15. That means that universities are now required to fund programmes that previously were supported by government, and there has been a decline in capital investment and an 80% cut in the teaching grant. So will the Minister confirm how much funding in real terms universities will lose in each of the next 5 years as a result of their current position and their decision to freeze fees? And now that the government have increased the student loan repayment threshold, it means, whatever else it might mean for benefit or otherwise of the students concerned, it means that they are going to miss their own RAB target by around 15%. So will the Minister also confirm if they are going to revise that target? The University and College Union, responding to the Chancellor's budget statement, I think got it right, said the glaring omission from today's speech was any support for current higher education students or further detail on the Prime Minister's promised review of university funding in England. And that's why we have persistently, in both the HE and FE bills that came through before the general election, argued the case for much greater focus on some of the particular groups who are going to be affected by that. And that should go to the heart of the way in which student loans are handed out at the moment. The Minister will know that the Student Loans Company has been in some controversy recently. But the issue, which I'm not going to dwell on today, but the issue of overpayments and how that has affected many of those students just brings us back to the point that this is a situation where actually the government, the Student Loans Company, are operating a system which is beginning quite significantly to fail. And I might say to the Minister in passing that perhaps if the nature of the Student Loans Company Board was a lot slightly broader than it is in the moment, or indeed the nature of the Office of Students Board was broader than it is at the moment, that we might actually have some perhaps different light shed on this area. I do want, however, to say that we appreciate the fact that the Chancellor has listened to our call for proper information sharing between HMRC and the Student Loans Company, and I hope, even though it's been postponed till 2019, that that will have a major impact on the current situation. Sir David, there is a great deal of thought to be given to any major changes in student finance, but directions of travel matter. We are clear what our direction of travel is. It is a direction of travel where we build bridges for people, not where we put barriers in their way by a series of measures that actually stress private good as opposed to public good and keep people in silos.
Minister, Joe Johnson.
Thank you, Sir David. I'm grateful to the petitioners for giving us the chance to have this debate, as well as to the member for Hartlepool for taking it forward in this way. Enabling people from all backgrounds to take advantage of the opportunities provided by higher education is obviously an important goal for this government. Since reforming the student finance system in 2012, the government has been able to lift the enforced cap on student numbers that have been in place for many years, and to remove the associated cap on social mobility that it represented. It's been able to enable record numbers of 18-year-olds, including those from disadvantaged backgrounds, to start in higher education. And it has also, of course, increased the total resources available to universities by about 25% per student per degree, according to the IFS. So as a result of all of this, increased numbers of students stand to benefit from increased lifetime earnings of at least £100,000 more than non-graduates after tax. However, it is only fair that graduates should share some of the costs associated with their education, rather than those costs falling to the taxpayer alone. The system is designed to ensure that those who benefit contribute to the costs of higher education in proportion to the benefits that they receive from it. Now, this motion raises the question of whether we should reduce tuition fees to £3,000. In our view, that would be a big step backwards. We estimate that it would cost the government an additional £6 billion a year than under the current system. It would mean that the government would have to choose whether to reduce funding to universities, to reintroduce a cap on the number of students who could access higher education, or to ask taxpayers, many of whom will themselves be non-graduates, to pay that £6 billion additional cost. Now, none of these options, in our view, is palatable. We need our universities to be well-funded so that they can equip our graduates with the skills and knowledge that they need to contribute to our economy. The Honourable Member for Poplar, I'm just going to respond to the point made by the Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse, then I'll let the Honourable Member for Glasgow East come in. The Honourable Member for Poplar and Limehouse clearly doesn't support the wholesale abolition of tuition fees, which I understand to be the present policy of the Labour Party. But I would hope that he would acknowledge that the most worrying effect of reducing fees to £3,000 would be to lower the participation of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Because to lower spending and to control spending in the context of rising demand for what would effectively be free higher education, the Treasury would push hard to introduce student number controls, which we, thanks to our present student finance system, have been able to lift under our current arrangements. Member Glasgow East wants to come in.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The Minister was saying, just mentioning that who should pay the fees, who should actually shoulder the responsibility for that. And many taxpayers, of course, if you present it to them, do you want to fund this particular student £9,000 a year going to university? Probably their answer would be no. But if you were to put it to them, do you want to have teachers in our schools, nurses and doctors in our health service, engineers working in different projects? And to do that, your taxes will fund this. I think the answer would be quite different.
Government recognises that this is a cost that needs to be shared in proportion to the benefits that flow from higher education. There are public benefits, which the government makes a contribution to on behalf of taxpayers, and there are private benefits, which we believe individual students should make a contribution to. We have a mixed economy for our higher education system, and that's one which we believe makes it sustainable and fair.
Caroline Hunt. Thank the Minister for giving way once again. And of course, as part of the private benefits, if he is suggesting that the private benefits would be increased salary, then part of that increased salary would be an increased tax that these people would be paying. Therefore, they will be contributing simply by their salary, if that is the case.
Indeed, they do. but it is also important that they make a direct contribution that relates to the benefit that they've received that's been provided for them by a public funding contribution. Mr. Yeah, happy.
For some minutes for giving way. To reinforce the point by the Honourable Lady from Glasgow North West, but in response to that which he was challenging me, he's absolutely right, Mr. Chope. I don't support the full abolition, but neither do I support the £9,000. I think there is a balance to be struck. And his comment that the Treasury will press hard, well, I know they do. I have been in government. The Treasury always press hard. It's a political choice that one makes and that the Treasury makes and that the Cabinet makes, how far they are allowed to press and where the trade-offs are. The Honourable Lady says there should be contributions from elsewhere. We've already seen the Health Service saying we should have golden handcuffs for those who want to qualify as doctors and let them free of their tuition fees to get them into the NHS and keep them there for the rest of their professional life. But these choices and these judgments have to be made.
Minister.
Well, I would just note that higher education is a devolved policy responsibility in the United Kingdom. And it is parts of the United Kingdom that have the present level of fees that we have in England that have been able to lift student number controls. Other administrations, with their own sets of policy choices, haven't been able to lift student number controls. And as a result, we've seen in those administrations far lower levels of widening participation than we currently see in England. Because we genuinely think that returning to a cap on student numbers would be absolutely disastrous for young people from lower incomes.
Would the Minister give way on that very point?
Yeah, happy to.
I'm grateful to him because I think there is a crucial element of this that is in danger of being overlooked, which is the lifting of the cap on numbers of students has been extended in one particular direction further and very constructively across the country, which is the policy on nursing degrees and indeed the new policy of nursing associates that complements it. And if it wasn't for that, frankly, in counties like mine, like Gloucestershire, we would be net deficit of about 350 new nurses a year, whereas with the new policy, the University of Gloucester has been able to offer nursing degrees, and that will, over time, mean that we will have homegrown nurses in far greater numbers than previously, and I'm grateful to the government for that.
My friend in Gloucester is absolutely right. Putting the funding of nursing places onto the sustainable basis that other students are on is going to enable far greater participation and uplift in the numbers of nursing students in this country. Taxpayers already contribute around half of the costs of the higher education system, and we believe it's right that graduates should also contribute and that this contribution should be linked to their income. This means, as I said, that those who've benefited the most from their education repay their fair share. The member for Leeds North West gave us interesting insights from Latin America, which I know is a source of great inspiration for the Labour Party at present. We look with interest to see what other lessons he draws from Venezuela and other countries from that part of the world as they develop their ever-shifting policy on higher education. But every year, this government considers the appropriate maximum level of tuition fees and sets a cap. The government considers whether the maximum tuition fee amounts should be uprated in line with inflation to support continued investment in course delivery. Now, we are committed to ensuring the ongoing sustainability of our world-class higher education sector. The student finance system ensures that teaching in our universities is well-funded, but that individuals don't pay until they're seeing a good return on their investment. The continued investment in the higher education sector, as I said, has seen funding per student per degree rise by 25% since the 2012 reforms. And what's more is that funding per student is today at the highest level that it's been in almost 30 years. The recent decision to freeze the maximum level of tuition fees in the 18-19 academic year takes account of the views of young people, the views of their parents, and also the views of Parliament. We've evaluated the current position of our universities, and on that basis, we've decided not to uprate tuition fees by inflation for the 2018-19 academic year. Students will therefore see maximum fees of around £300 less than if the maximum fee had been uprated with inflation. The Honourable Member for Reading East mentioned a contribution to the cost of their higher education. The Honourable Member mentioned that his constituents were struggling with their repayments. I would just give, by way of an example, something which might help him to put it in context. If one of his constituents is earning, for sake of argument, £30,000 a year, as a result of our decision to increase the repayment threshold to £25,000 with effect from April next year, one of his constituents on a salary of that amount would be repaying about £1.20 a day. And we think that's a reasonable amount for someone on that level of income to be repaying as a contribution towards the cost of their higher education.
Isn't it correct, though, that those earning far more will end up paying less because they will repay their loan much more quickly? And so their total amount of interest they're paying will be far less than somebody on 25,000 will take much longer to repay their loan.
Yeah, indeed, that's right, is that the amount that someone repays is linked to the amount that they earn in any 1 year, but also that the repayment will be more rapid for someone on a higher level of income. He is, of course, absolutely right. The current student finance system removes the financial barriers for those hoping to study and avoids students facing upfront tuition fee costs. We've maintained the universal accessibility of the system that allows all eligible students to access the required finance, regardless of their background and financial history. Monthly repayments depend on income, critically, and not to interest rates on their debt or to the amount that they've actually borrowed. From April 2018, we will increase the repayment threshold to £25,000 and then adjust it annually in line with average earnings after that. This change will benefit around 600,000 borrowers and will continue to benefit future borrowers. Many borrowers who've already graduated will see their monthly repayments reduced, and this change forms part of a considered and costed proposal which reinforces the principle of our student finance system and puts money back in the pockets of graduates.
Would my honourable friend give way? I'm grateful to him, and I think these changes are important and will make a difference to a large number of people, as he's indicated. There are two things, though, which he knows I don't entirely agree with. One is the interest rate when these student loans revert to being repaid with normal interest. I don't see the argument for having them using RPI as a base rather than CPI. And the second one is a wider point, which is the universities themselves believe that they would be able to attract even more students from abroad, which would help the funding of our universities, were students to be excluded from the immigration numbers. Does my honourable friend agree that that is something we might look forward to one day?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend raises some interesting points. It's been a long-standing feature of the system that it uses RPI, as this includes costs that are relevant to the basket of goods and cost services that students consume, including housing costs and mortgage interest costs. So that's why, historically, RPI has been embedded in the student finance system. On international students, they make a massive contribution to our higher education system and to our economy and to our society. They enrich the learning experience, and the government welcomes them warmly. We wish to see more international students come and study in the United Kingdom, and the members will have seen some positive changes in the budget, including an expansion of the Tier 1 exceptional talent cap route into the country. The budget also contained measures to make it easier for students to flip into Tier 2 after they've finished studying, which means that they can move into work straight after they complete their studies rather than waiting until they receive a diploma sometime later, and that's going to be particularly valuable for people doing postgraduate courses. So the government is taking steps to ensure that we have a competitive offer for international students so that we continue to be attractive and competitive around the world in attracting international students. Now, the Honourable Member for Glasgow East suggested that the tighter controls on student numbers in Scotland were not restricting opportunities there. Now, I know she didn't want to hear about the OECD's PISA rankings, but she may be interested in taking note of what the Sutton Trust has been saying around student numbers in Scotland and the way, in its opinion, they have been restricting the aspiration of young people in Scotland. The Sutton Trust recently stated that Scottish 18-year-olds from the most advantaged areas are still more than 4 times more likely to go straight to university than those from the least advantaged areas in Scotland. And this compares, by the way, to 2.4 times more likely in England. So we obviously do take note of the points she made, but she shouldn't give the impression that social mobility in Scotland is being advanced by higher education policy there to a greater extent than our policies here in England.
As I explained that during my speech, much of the data on student movement is not captured by UCAS figures, which are not therefore captured in the Sutton Trust report. So it is not a true reflection of the picture in Scotland.
Minister.
Well, I take note of her comments. The Sutton Trust has been engaged in this area of study for many years and has had plenty of opportunities to take on board points from her party over the years, but has evidently chosen not to. This government remains committed to widening participation in HE. England's sustainable student finance system has enabled record numbers of disadvantaged 18-year-olds to benefit, and as my honourable friend, the honourable member for North East Derbyshire noted, in 2016, disadvantaged 18-year-olds in England were 43% more likely to go to university than they were in 2009, and that the application rate for disadvantaged 18-year-olds has increased to a record high once again in this latest 2017 entry cycle. Happy to give it.
Yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity, Minister, and also for the wide-ranging discussion of a number of aspects of these issues in his speech. I would ask the Minister if he might want to meet employers from my constituency, possibly from other high-cost areas, to address the particular issue which my honourable friend mentioned, that namely that those graduates on middle incomes may end up paying more in their tuition fee repayments over time than those on the very highest salaries, and indeed that this may have a damaging effect on local economies. I'd be very grateful if we could meet him and officials on this matter.
Minister.
I'm always happy to discuss these matters with colleagues and be keen to do so going forward. There is always more to do, though, of course, in widening participation, including on the progression of disadvantaged students to more selective institutions and ensuring that the retention, success and progress of some of these students is better. Universities have committed to spend £860 million on improving access and success for students from disadvantaged backgrounds through access agreements agreed in 2018-2019 with the Independent Director of Fair Access, and through the Higher Education and Research Act recently passed, the government has introduced a number of measures to make further progress. These include the statutory duty on the new regulator, the Office for Students, to have regard to equality of opportunity in connection with access and success in higher education for students from disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. It also created, of course, the Director of Fair Access and Participation within the OFS as an executive board member. And access and participation plans, which are the successor to access agreements, will see any provider wanting to charge higher fees having to have a plan agreed before they can do so as a condition of their registration with the Office for Students. The Act also created a transparency duty on all providers, which means that they will have to publish application, offer, acceptance, completion and attainment information broken down by gender, ethnicity and socioeconomic background. So all students can make an informed choice about which university they attend, and so that universities can see where they need to make further progress on widening access. Now, the Honourable Member for Blackpool South, in his thoughtful speech, rightly mentioned numbers of part-time and mature students, as he has done on many occasions when we've discussed these matters. Studying part-time and later in life can bring enormous benefits for individuals, the economy, and for employers. That's why the government is taking steps to help hard-working people who want to gain new skills and to advance their careers by studying part-time. Government intends to further enhance the student finance package for part-time students by introducing part-time maintenance loans in 2018-2019, And we've also enshrined in law, in the same act I just mentioned, a need for the new higher education sector regulator to have regard for part-time study in its actions as regulator of the sector. The Honourable Member for Blackpool South also mentioned dropout rates. Access to higher education is, of course, only one aspect of how we need to improve social mobility. The full benefits of gaining a degree are only experienced by those who actually complete their studies. Non-continuation rates for UK students at English institutions are lower now than in 2009-10 for all categories, for young, mature, disadvantaged and BME students. So whilst progress has been made, the government continues to look carefully at this area and is working with universities to focus on improving retention continually via the access agreement process and also via the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes framework, which includes non-continuation and dropout rates as one of its core metrics, as the Honourable Member knows. This government is committed to removing access to finance as a barrier to entering higher education, which is why we continue to make more money available to students than ever before. Many honourable members today have mentioned living costs. Students who have started their courses this academic year in 17-18 have access to the highest ever amounts of funding to support their living costs at university. Our system deliberately targets living cost support at those from the lowest income families who need it most. Replacing maintenance grants with loans, the theme of several members' remarks, enabled the government to increase support for full-time students' living costs by 10.3% for those students on the lowest incomes in 16-17, with a further 2.8% increase in such support for the current year. With a view to the future, we are further strengthening our approach to widening participation by placing an overarching duty on the Office for Students to consider the promotion of equality of opportunity in relation to access and participation in all that it does. The new Director for Fair Access and Participation will have a clear role within the Office for Students, looking right across the student life cycle. The current student finance system, Mr. Chair, is achieving our aims of widening participation and increasing the income that goes to the sector. As I said, funding per student per degree up 25% since the funding reforms came in at the beginning of the last Parliament. The university system is better funded than it's been at any point over the last 30 years. And it's the progressive nature of this system that is ensuring that higher education is at the same time open to all people who have the potential to benefit from it. And in all of this, government is ensuring that the costs of our system are split fairly between graduates and other taxpayers, with graduate contributions linked to income. The current system has allowed the sector to grow and made higher education accessible to a greater number of 18-year-olds from disadvantaged backgrounds than ever before. Reducing or abolishing fees would, I'm afraid, put us back to the bad old days of underfunded universities, limited access for disadvantaged students, and would, I'm afraid, inevitably result in often hard-pressed taxpayers paying the bill for a system that would benefit the few, not the many. Bad for students, bad for universities, and poor value for money.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 182953 relating to university tuition fees. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes just have it. Order, order.